Essential business writing skills, and this rewrite module deals with punctuation fundamentals. Remember, we're going to edit in this order. First, we'll edit with an eye towards completeness, then organization, then style, then correctness, and punctuation is probably the area of correctness that people have the most trouble with. And I will be the first to admit that this stuff is not the most exciting stuff in the world, but because this is something that a lot of people have trouble with, it is important to drill on the fundamentals. So we'll go over the basic rules for using the major punctuation marks, and let's start with the most often used punctuation mark, the comma. This is also the punctuation mark that has the greatest amount of flexibility. In other words, there are a number of times when you can use it, but you don't have to. Okay, comma basics, when are you going to use it? Items in a series. The case will be available in black, comma, blue, comma, and green. One of the kind of thorny issues here is that comma prior to the and. Do you have to put that comma prior to the and? No, you don't. And so some people will leave that off, but my thought on that is, why not just put it in to make sure that everyone's crystal clear with what's going on? But you don't have to. Okay, another major use of the comma is to set off a long introductory phrase. Even before he was able to run the tests to validate his invention, comma, Thomas Edison began to prepare the patent application. Another comma basic is to set off quotations. Sue asked, comma, quote, is this the final ad copy, question mark, end quote. Another comma basic to set off non-essential clauses. The coupon promotion, comma, which had been tested previously, comma, will run in November. That clause, which had been tested previously, is not essential. You could take it out of the sentence, and the sentence would still be just fine. The coupon promotion will run in November. This gives a little extra explanatory but not essential information. Another comma basic usage is to set off independent clauses joined by a conjunction. The coupon promotion will run in November, comma, and it will run again in May. Another comma basic is to set off appositives. And a positive is something that explains a little bit more about that which immediately preceded it. Dan Quayle, comma, the former vice president, comma, will speak at the meeting. For those who don't remember Dan Quayle, we're going to tell you a little bit more about him. Dan Quayle, comma, the former vice president. The thing about appositives is you could flip the order. The former vice president, comma, Dan Quayle, comma, will speak at the meeting. It tells a little bit more about that which preceded it. Another common use is to separate consecutive adjectives. She had a quick, comma, cunning mind. Anytime you think that there might be confusion or misreading and a comma would make it clearer, use the comma. For example, before quitting, comma, the team took a vote. If I didn't have that comma in there, it would read, before quitting the team, and then the reader would be confused. So to prevent that misreading, that misunderstanding, put that comma after quitting. Those are the major comma uses, but again, there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to the comma. Okay, next up, the semicolon. When do we use the semicolon? When we have two clauses that are not joined by a conjunction. The coupon promotion will run in November, semicolon. It will run again next May. We could have two clauses that are joined by a conjunction, but those clauses themselves have commas. So in that case, when we've got two clauses joined by conjunction, but the clauses have commas, separate those clauses with that semicolon. The coupon promotion will run in February, comma, April, comma, and June, semicolon, and it will also run in the second half in August, comma, October, comma, and December. In fact, we talked about items in a series being separated by commas, but that if those items have commas, we need a little bit of a harsher break. So items in a series, but the items have commas. The new products team will include Bob Jenkins, comma, marketing, semicolon, Ginny Lauer, comma, sales, semicolon, and Karen Davidson, comma, operations, period. Those are our major uses of the semicolon. Next up, the colon. We're going to use a colon after the salutation in a business letter. Dear Sir or Madam, colon. Dear Ms. Smith, colon. Dear Tom, colon. This begs the question, is it appropriate to use a first name salutation in a business letter? Absolutely, if you're on a first name basis with that person. And a lot of times you'll become friendly with people that you do business with, and you will be on a first name basis. So it's kind of silly to formally use the title and the surname. So go ahead and Dear Tom, but this is a business letter, so there's a colon after it. We'll also use a colon to introduce a list. We need to improve these areas, colon, forecasting, comma, communication, comma, and analysis. But don't do this. We need to improve in colon, forecasting, comma, communication, comma, and analysis. The reason that you do not use a comma in that sentence is the sentence flows without the comma. Even though there's a list that follows, the sentence itself flows grammatically, so don't put that colon in there. We'll use a colon to emphasize, note what follows. We've got to get distribution there, colon, Walmart. We're emphasizing what follows, in this case, Walmart. We'll use a colon between independent clauses where the first clause sets up the second clause. Apple shocked the business community, colon, they dropped the price on the iPhone. Even though Apple shocked the business community is an independent clause and could be its own sentence, it kind of leaves you leaning, and the next clause then explains what the shock was. They dropped the price on the iPhone. Next up is the quotation mark. We'll use a quotation mark, of course, to show a direct quote. Sue asked, comma, quote, is this the final ad copy? Question mark, end quote. We'll also use quotation marks for a direct quote that is not a complete sentence. Bill Gates admitted that Control-Alt-Delete was not, quote, the best idea we ever had, period, end quote. That was part of a quote that Gates said. It was not the best idea we ever had, but we didn't do the entire quote. So the part that we were quoting directly, we put in quotes. You do not separate that with a comma. Quotation marks, whenever you want to emphasize a word for any reason, Paul thought the meeting was, quote, awkward, end quote. But don't overdo it, that graphic there of Dr. Evil, who was always using the air quotes. A couple of things about the quotation marks. Very common mistakes that people will make with quotation marks are to have problems with what to do with other punctuation vis-a-vis the quotation mark. So here's our rules. Periods and commas always, always, always go inside the quote marks, always. Colons and semicolons always go outside the quote marks. So the following sentence is wrong. Please mark this quote fragile, end quote, period. A lot of times people will do that, and their rationale is, well, those quotes are just for the word fragile, the period's for the entire sentence, so the period goes outside the quote marks. Nope, never. The period always goes inside the quote marks. Now, the question mark, the exclamation mark, those depend. Question marks and exclamation marks go inside or outside depending on the situation. Some examples. Correct. Definitely mark this quote fragile, end quote, exclamation mark. The exclamation mark is for the whole sentence. The quotes are just for the word fragile, so the exclamation mark goes outside. Correct. John asked, comma, quote, how are you feeling today? Question mark, end quote. The question mark goes for the whole quote. The quotes, of course, go for the whole quote, so the question mark goes inside. But why is this marked, quote, fragile, end quote, question mark? In that sentence, the quotes are only for the word fragile. The question mark is for the whole sentence, so the question mark goes outside of the quote mark. How about the single quotes? This is another area where people sometimes make mistake. Use a single quote only for a quote within a quote. So the correct example, John said, comma, quote, I will respond with a single quote, no comment, end single quote, when asked about the loan, period, end quote. No comment was a direct quote, but that was a quote that was inside of the larger quote, and so we downsized to those single quotes. But here's a wrong example. Mark this prospect questionable. Hey, I'm only using quotes for the one word questionable, so I'll use the single quotes. No, That's not the case. Even if you're only using quote marks for one word, if you're not within a quote already, use the regular double quotes. Next up is parentheses. We are going to use parentheses for explanatory or non-essential information. The low volume items, parentheses, Formula 409, comma, soft scrub, end parentheses, will not be on display at the trade show, period. We could take those out. The low volume items will not be on display at the trade show. They're just in there for further explanation. They're not essential to the sentence. A lot of times you've got a choice between using parentheses or commas. The example I had earlier about the appositive, Dan Quayle, comma, the former vice president, comma, will speak at the meeting. We could put that in parentheses. Dan Quayle, parentheses, the former vice president, end parentheses, will speak at the meeting. Apostrophes. We use apostrophes to show the omission of letters, as in contractions like can't or won't. Are contractions too informal for business writing? No. Business writing usually is going to be a little less formal than it has been in the past. But if we're trying to make the document more formal, then we wouldn't use quotation marks. But for general everyday business correspondence, I said quotation marks, I meant contractions. We can use contractions in everyday business conversation. Of course, you can create your own contractions. Cincinnati, if I'm going to create a document and I'm going to keep repeating Cincinnati, 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 maybe there's a sales report, I might, the first time I use Cincinnati, create my own contraction and say hereafter CIN apostrophe TI. We'll use apostrophes to show possession. John's, Mrs. Smith's. Now, if the noun does not end in an S or an S sound like a Z, just add the apostrophe plus S. But if the noun ends in S or an S sound, then it depends. If it's plural, add an apostrophe, but no S. Just stop right there. If it's singular, add an apostrophe plus the S, or just add the apostrophe, whatever you think sounds better. When omitting letters or numbers, put the apostrophe where the omission occurs. Here's a mistake that a lot of people make. The 90s, 90 apostrophe S. No, because that's not what's missing when we're using that for the 1990s. The correct method is to put apostrophe 90S for the 1990s. Next up, the period. Of course, we use the period at the end of a sentence, and we use it for abbreviations. This is my final offer, period. Mr., Ms., Doctor, manufacturing department, etc., e.g., for example. Use a period, of course, for those abbreviations. Abbreviations are preferred to contractions. Do be careful sometimes. Make sure that it's an abbreviation and not an acronym. Acronyms don't have periods. Abbreviations, of course, do. Next up, the question mark. We will use the question mark at the end of a sentence that is a question. Sue asked, comma, quote, is this the final ad copy? Question mark, end quote. How are you feeling today? Question mark. Don't use a question mark with a polite request. Could you send me a copy of the daily sales report? That's not really a question. That's just a polite request, and so you just use a period there. Of course, if I'm not sure if the person can, I'm not sure that that's a possibility, that would be a question, and in that case, I'd put the question mark there. But in most instances, that's really just a polite request there. You can also show a question mark to show uncertainty. The worst single-day drop in stock market history was not during the Great Depression, but much more recently. 1987, question mark. That implies that I think it was 1987 or right around there, but I'm not 100% sure. The exclamation mark. We will use an exclamation mark after an interjection or exclamatory sentence. Wow! Exclamation mark. The results from the Western region are fantastic! Exclamation mark. We can also use it to show extreme surprise or emphasis. The worst single-day drop in stock market history was a one-day decline of 22%, parentheses, exclamation mark, end parentheses, on October 19, 1987. I'm trying to show dramatic emphasis on that 22% number. Okay, the dash. Use a dash for emphasis or an abrupt change in thought. An insanely great idea, dash, 1,000 songs in your pocket, dash, was the big idea that launched the iPod. Don't use the dash too much or it loses emphasis. And when you use a dash and not a hyphen. Use the dash, not a hyphen. Now you create the dash by hitting the hyphen key twice and not adding any spaces. A dash should look like this. Dash. Now that's a dash. This is not a dash. Hyphen, hyphen. It is just two consecutive hyphens. Speaking of hyphens, you use hyphens for compound adjectives like fast track career, up to the minute report, 60-second analysis. He was the first Cuban-American baseball player, but he is a Cuban American. The reason Cuban-American is hyphenated is because those two words together are modifying baseball player. But in the next sentence, Cuban is modifying American, and so it is not hyphenated. We use hyphens with certain prefixes and suffixes, but not most, so do be careful with that. Self-evident, anti-inflationary. We use hyphens with numbers like fractions, 1/2, 2/3, and in all of the numbers from 21 to 99, except of course for 30, 40, 50, and so on. So 20-4, 80-3, and so on. Brackets. We use brackets only within direct quotes. We use brackets to make changes within a direct quote. Why would we do that? Here's a couple of examples. I'm going to send him to the NATO meeting. That was the direct quote. But out of context, the reader doesn't know who him is, and so what I will do is I will pull him out and replace it with the name to which him refers, in this case, John Smith. I'm going to send bracket John Smith, end bracket, to the NATO meeting. Or sometimes a direct quote might have some nomenclature or language that the everyday reader's not familiar with, and so I will take that nomenclature out and replace it with more everyday language. The composition of the DJIA will probably change next month. Now, for my average reader who may not know that DJIA stands for the Dow Jones Industrial Average, an index of 30 companies, I'll just go ahead and change that. So, quote, the composition of the bracket stock market index end bracket will probably change next month. The ellipsis. The ... We use the ellipsis to show the omission of words in direct quotations. I accept the nomination for Judge of Blaine County with a full and heavy heart. I want to take some of the words out of the middle, so just I accept the nomination ... with a full and heavy heart. We'll also use an ellipsis when a sentence trails off at the end. I thought he would do better, comma, but ... Experts disagree as to whether or not to put a fourth dot, the period, at the end. One of several things that you don't get 100% agreement on as it relates to punctuation and other grammar issues. Okay, that's enough on punctuation basics for now. Next up will be the punctuation exercise. So make sure you download the punctuation exercise and do that prior to the next video.